Hello. Hello. Welcome to Abralin ao Vivo, Linguists Online, which is an initiative of the Brazilian Linguistics Association. I'm Ben Rampton of King's College London, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Dr. Heike Wiese from Humboldt University, Berlin. I'm not going to take a long time introducing Heike, but to find out more about her, I do recommend that you look at her website, and you'll find an amazing array of work, collaborators, publications, funded projects covering linguistic structure, the sociolinguistic dynamics of multilingualism, practical interventions in language education right across the age range. And what always strikes me most about Heike is the way she combines rigor, rootedness, and bold creativity. And just to give you a little glimpse, of her kind of grounded energy and organizational imagination, let me just read out how she describes the research center that she set up at Humboldt University. The center, it says, the Center, Language and Urban Diversity serves as a site for networking and outreach for researchers and practitioners, speakers, teachers, policymakers, language lovers, and multipliers. We are all the multilingual, linguistically diverse city. Wir alle sind die mehrsprachige Stadt. We are all the multilingual, linguistically diverse city. Her inclusiveness, the way she draws her inspiration from her immediate environment. We'll hear more of that coming up soon. But before I hand over to Heike, just a word or two about the procedure tonight. Heike has got up to an hour for her talk, and then we'll spend some time in questions and answers. While she's talking, please do use the chat, the YouTube chat, for questions, and then afterwards I'll do my best to present them to Heike for her to respond to. So right now, it gives me great pleasure to hand you over to Heike, Professor Heike Wiese, who is going to talk to us about integrating linguistic multi-competence with grammatical structure. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm rather embarrassed now, I have to admit. I hope I'll be up to that. Yes, let me share my screen. I'm going to try and reconcile two research strands today. Two strands focusing on the one hand on linguistic multi-competence as a cover term, and I'm going to come to that, and on the other hand with grammatical structure. Let me first acknowledge the funding that supported different aspects of the research I'm going to show to present today, and the many collaborators who had their part in this. So two research strands. This is the one strand where we've some quotes here that I think are quite typical of this trend. It's dominant in, I think, today's sociolinguistics, where we find calls to do something like move away from the attempts to capture language as a system, or denaturalize the idea that there are distinct languages, or challenging one of the most widely held views of language, namely that language can be separated into different languages, such as Russian, Latin, and Greenlandic. On the other hand, we find a research strand that focuses on linguistic structure, and where people are quite happy to talk about what singular count DPs in German are like, or distinguishing Bavarian from Standard German, or characterizing Indian English as a distinct variety, or in contact linguistics, talking about the intrusion of an L2 form when speaking L1, or defining a contact language as a new language that arises in a contact situation. This somehow doesn't go together. On the one hand, we do not have any languages. Everything is more fluid and less bounded as we might think. On the other hand, people are constantly describing different languages in a way that suggests really strict borders. So we have fluidity as a general term and a system on the other hand. Fluidity, assuming no bound languages, something like multi-competence. On the other hand, a system where people are describing grammatical structure and coherence, repertoires and resources on the one hand, internal organization on the other. Fluidity, where people are talking about translanguaging, polylanguaging, bricolage. On the other hand, code switching, cross-linguistic transfer that suggests different systems. So if we look at systematic descriptions, grammatical descriptions, it strikes me that we do find internal organization and coherence. I find it very convincing to talk about that there are no bound languages when I look at people's actual practices. But then if I look at, for instance, cross-linguistic transfer. So when elements from one language are used in the context of another language, this does look like something is happening here, as if they are coming from one possibly bound area and moving into another possibly bound area. So let's have a look at the word computer. And I had the, this word can get integrated into German. It's a loan word in German. And when you heard me pronouncing computer, you probably could already hear this, the way it gets integrated. I had initially planned on saying, let's have a look at the word computer with a perfect English pronunciation and how it's pronounced in German. But my daughters, who are native speakers of English and German, said they both sound the same when you pronounce them, Mummy. They both sound German. So as you can see, computer is not just spelled differently, namely it's capitalized as a noun in German. It's also pronounced differently in a German way, computer. It gets gender. It's der computer, it's masculine. It gets a different kind of plural, namely a zero affix here. Die computer is the plural form. And it gets case marking. Dem Computern is a dative plural form. So something seems to be happening. This thing moves from here to there, and then it behaves in a different way, namely consistent with how things behave here. And this is German, and that is English. So there seems to be something going on. On the other hand, we do see that these systems are fluid and that we have something like multi-competence, people accessing different resources. How do we reconcile this? And I think we have to reconcile this. It's not an option to just say, okay, then we just don't work together. You sociolinguists getting on my nerves saying there are no languages. I want to investigate grammar. I know there are different languages. Or on the other hand, you grammarians are just doing this ideological thing, thinking there are different languages. I don't think that's an option. We have to reconcile this if we want to move forward as a field. And also because sometimes we're using this two perspectives at the same time. And here another quote from the very same paper from Blommert and Repton, where first they are telling me there are no named languages, English, German, Bengali, all ideological constructions. Then in the same paper, they are quite happy talking about a mix of Chinese, Korean. So on a translation from Chinese to English. I have to say, when I first read this, I thought, I got you there. So now you're suddenly talking about different languages. So this is inconsistent. But then when thinking about it more deeply, I think this makes a lot of sense to have these two perspectives. And I'm going to argue today that we can bring these two views or these two under a perspective of communicative situations, that we have to start from communicative situations. I'm going to define this in a few slides. Let me first, before I develop my idea, give you a general idea of a general picture of what it's going to be like. So my point is that we're starting with communicative situations and the co-occurrence of linguistic elements in these situations. These are the linguistic resources. They are co-occurring in specific communicative situations. This supports coherence and systematicity. And from here, we can, but don't have to, go to socially constructed languages, dialects, as social indices. So I think that communicative situations are the primary thing we should think about. This primacy of communicative situations has several implications. I'm defining communication as a social activity involving language use. So any social activity, meaning it's always about interaction. A communicative situation then is something characterized by defined by the relevant characteristics of the context or setting of this communication. We do have general parameters, for instance, formal versus informal, written versus spoken settings. But in general, there is no extensive list as a definition of a specific communicative situations, but it's basically what the speakers pick up as relevant or salient. And this can depend on the time, locality of situations, and can also change over time. For instance, one thing I'm very much interested in are urban contact dialects. An example is Sheng in Kenya, and here the communicative situation changed. The association spread from first being with multi-ethnic urban youth. This is the kind of speech community that supported this dialect or this multi-ethnic, spread to urbanite. Now it's associated with urbanite. So the kind of situation can change. And it's always gradual. So we don't have categorical differences of communicative situations, but permeable borders between them. We just abstract from them for analysis. When I say communicative situations are primary, there's the primacy of communicative situations, then that means that it's not first and foremost that we're thinking about elements that are used in one communicative situation rather than in another, because they belong to different languages. But elements are represented as belonging to different languages because they are used in or associated with different communicative situations. It's the concepts that are first. So what's central is the speaker's choice of resources for different communicative situations. You're finding yourself in a certain communicative situation, and I'm going to use the abbreviation from now on. ComSit is so much easier to pronounce. So you're finding yourself in a certain ComSit, and you're choosing your resources accordingly. These resources are coming from your mind. So this allows us a unified perspective on multilingualism, bidialectalism, registered choice, style shifting, code switching, etc. It's all about the resources you're using in one concept rather than in the other. And remember, there are gradual rather than discrete differences between these concepts, and that also means between dialects and languages alike, depending on the concept. So for me, this is quite salient, English and German. I'm coming mostly from German, speaking mostly English professionally. So what do we have here? We have something like can be more German or more English. On the right, it's nearly only German. On the left, it's nearly only English. And but this is gradual. That's a gradual distinction between these two extremes. If we're thinking of, say, the top as being the more informal concepts and the bottom as the more formal ones, then we get something like this. So at least in countries like, for instance, Germany or the UK, where the more informal you get, the more you might mix. But that doesn't mean you can't mix. So there can, for instance, I could well imagine that I'm integrating some kind of German term into my talk now, even though it's a quite formal situation for me. Or if I gave a talk in Germany, I would fit in quite a few more English terms in my talk, knowing people know English anyway. So how do we start from these concepts and how do we get to the languages? Let this be a bunch of linguistic elements. These are my resources. Or in other words, this is some kind of feature pool. I'm going to come to this term in the next slide, I think. This is the feature pool. These are just resources. This is all kinds of elements I have in my mind. Think of first language acquisition. What is acquisition like? It means first everything is connected, and then some connections get lost and others get further supported, get strengthened. And then we're getting from feature pool to something I call a feature pond. Namely, we have these more systematic elements. Coherence arises. Some elements might remain shared. Number 5 works for both, obviously. But what you see here, we don't have all the connections anymore, just some connections, but these connections are stronger. And this is because I've been using number 5, 6, 7, 8 in composite B, and number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in composite A. So something more systematic evolves here. From when initially the elements were underspecified for composites or indeed languages, now I have something typical of a learning process, namely that I don't just have a pool, I have a pond, some kind of system, some kind of ecology. And from this situation, something might arise like second order indices. They can arise, namely languages as second order indices, or varieties or register, something like where elements 1 to 5 don't just co-occur in composite A, but for me, they kind of take on the same coloring. So independently of where they will occur, they somehow belong together now. And this could be called English. And elements 5 to 8 co-occur in composite B. But for me, during this learning process, a second order kind of index might arise, and this now supports variety B. They've taken on this green coloring by themselves. They don't necessarily need this composite anymore, or this set of composites usually. They now belong together in my mind. So from pool to pond, and then possibly to different varieties. Once I have these varieties, of course, don't need to be neatly separated in my mind. They can go together in any old way. But the important thing is they keep this coloring, given the right social situation. So what does it mean to get from feature pool to feature pond? With the feature pool metaphor, I'm referring to a concept introduced before, a pool of competing features coming from different sources in language, dialect, context situations. That's where the metaphor comes from. What I suggested that we think of a pool that supports a network of independent features, some kind of rich ecology that brings forth interconnected patterns at different levels. So to use some pictures, from a pool of just everything together, you're getting into some system, something systematic, some ecology. And to take this metaphor even a bit further, we might want to think of the speaker as some kind of gardener for this pool, picks and chooses and can also change this. This kind of point perspective, I think, allows us to acknowledge systematic structural relations within and between different linguistic patterns and investigate patterns versus errors. This is something I find important because when I only think of a feature pool, I don't see the pattern when something new arises. This might just look like an error, and actually that is what you sometimes read in even in sociolinguistic papers talking about context situations. We read something like, and then they're using what is characteristic for this, say, youth language is gender errors, article is missing. From the point of feature point, there are no gender errors and the article isn't missing. This is a different kind of inflectional pattern, and these are bare nouns that don't need an article, obviously, because they don't go with an article. It seems to work. So you can acknowledge this if you have a feature point perspective without, and I find that just as important, neglecting speaker sociolinguistic repertoire, still being aware of that we have a repertoire here and not just two bound entities, while still capturing the selective choices from a broader range of linguistic resources in different concepts. Languages, I said, then work as something like second order indices. What do I mean with this? So a first order index would be that these elements are used together in different concepts. That was the first level after everything is connected. Yeah, elements are used together. I'm using this kind of words, patterns, structures, constructions in this concept, and this in the other, these in the other situation. The second order index would then be, they're associated with named languages for me. And there could be even further orders. Think of, now you have this idea of a language, you've constructed this language as a system in your mind, and you associate it with a specific speech community based on the community of practice, who uses this language. And then that's the point where questions of language ownership, speaker legitimacy might come in. Who is a legitimate speaker of this and that dialect or language? Who is a stereotypical speaker of this? Languages indices also means emphasizes that they are socially constructed and they are based on competency distinctions. They are not there by themselves and tell us what to use where, but they arise from composites. And a community of practice can then be understood as based on shared behavior in different composites. Languages as bound entities, once they've arisen, once we have socially constructed languages, can be very real in speaker's mind and as part of speaker's competences. If I have the right, or rather wrong, societal macro context, especially one that is characterized by ideologies of linguistic purism, like monolingual habitus, standard language ideology. This is the languageized world, how I understand it in a paper by Jaspers and Madsen. If you have that, if you have these languages as bounded entities, and you have people who have been trained through their social experience, so through their upbringing, to always only use elements of this language here and none of the other, and really keep them apart, then what is called translanguaging might not necessarily come natural to these people, but depending on the context, might need to be learned. The gradual process of separation that we assume coming from these, everything is mixed from this pool to the pond, accounts also for mixing, as known, for instance, very well in first language acquisition. The elements you had at the bottom all remain part of a speaker's repertoire if they are still being used. They are still resources. And the resulting systems you have are fluid over a lifespan, accounting for multi-competence. So this is not set in stone, that you have this concept and these elements are used. This can change over time. And there can always be shared elements. These elements can be, the separation between these elements can be sharper and stronger in such macro contexts that have are very much characterized by linguistic purism ideologies. Let's have a look at two examples. How does this work? How can we get composites? How can we account for composites? So here's an example for a lexical entry. Lexical entry for the term chicken in English. So we have the phonology, we have the syntax. This is characterized as a count noun. As you know, need stay a count noun. You can have grinder constructions. I always found the metaphor grinder a bit brutal, actually. But you can have these constructions where we're using something that is a count noun in one context initially as a mass noun. For instance, there's chicken in the soup, or there's chicken in the kebab. Semantics is chicken. And now the important thing, the composite. The composite is an element of what I just called E here. And E is just the cover term for all composites that are indexed as English. So once you have this socially constructed idea of there being English, now this is the composite will be part of everything that is indexed by English. Chicken is not bound to a specific register, for instance. And this index is then inherited by the lexical element, which is why I put a little E on the chicken on the right. Interestingly, just like computer, chicken has been borrowed into German. What happens? What happens is, first, it's spelled with a capital. You always get capitalized when you're a noun going into German. That's the one good thing about going into German as a noun. You get capitalized. And so chicken goes into German, it gets capitalized, and it's more important for me now, it gets integrated grammatically. Just like I described for computer, we now have an integration into this new system that we have here. And what does this look like? Looks like this. And those of you who speak German, and before that, no, chicken is not a term in German. Think again when you buy your next kebab or your next burger, because I think this is where it comes from, American fast food chains. First, the phonology. It's more like chicken. Then, interestingly, it's a mass noun right away. A mass noun and only a mass noun. And the semantics is that of this grinder chicken. Namely, you can have something like chicken and brot, chicken sandwich. And the interesting thing now for us is the concert. The concert is not just element of anything in German. I could not use this in a formal context. I couldn't even use it in an informal setting, say family. I speak English with my husband. I asked my daughter, what have you cooked? She would not say, I cooked chicken suppe in German. So this is only part of is only element of the communicative situations that are diners and where I use German. And this gives me this chicken element it's still indexed, the lexical element is indexed with D, but the concept is more specific. And the semantics is more specific than in English. And here you can see that it's really chicken can only be used for the grinder semantics, because the minute it's not ground anymore, the minute you have a whole bird, or half bird, you use the older German term Hähnchen or Huhn. That's the top. That's a Grillhähnchen. Yeah. What chicken keeps, in any case, is the association. In this case, the association with this with the English term. So there is still an association with it. Needn't be. I don't think with computer it is. With cakes, coming from cakes, even less. Nobody knows that this. Well, some linguists do, that this came from England, English at some point. But with chicken, the association is still there, and this makes it sound more globalized, or reminds you of American fast food. Now, this index of the source can provide a higher order index with a speech community, a language, and or its associated even higher order characteristics. So I said this can be globalization. In other contexts, let's say using Latin might have this association with education. Still other things may be more cool or urbanity. Think of Sheng in Kenya. Hood credibility. And the source system, in my example, it was English, can support further dynamics if it's still active in speakers' repertoires. And let's have a look at what this can look like. Dynamics you can find in Namibian German, for instance, much more than in Germany German. Namibian Germans are at least trilingual in daily life. They're always using not only German, but habitually every day using English and Afrikaans. English is what we're interested in here, because Namibian Germans say something like, das jobbt für mich, that jobs for me. That sounds weird, especially for people who are super fluent in English, given that it doesn't work in English. In English, you have to say that works for me. I said it doesn't work in English. Haha. Okay, so what does work look like? For work, we can think of a lexical entry like this, something like, in this sense, it's a verb referring to that something suits somebody, an experiencer. And through this work, through the term, it's associated with work as a noun or a verb, meaning labor, which is not the meaning it takes on in that works for me, but it's associated with it lexically through the same word. Through this semantics labor, it's associated with the term job, which can also be a noun or a verb. Now, job we have already in German as a loan word, and as you see, gets capitalized immediately. because it can only work as a noun, at least initially in German, meaning labor or something close to it. Now, through labor, it's also associated with the older German term Arbeit, which can be a noun or a verb. But this is not what Namibian Germans use. What Namibian Germans use is the three associations they get from using job in this suits me, job and for somebody. Why do they do that? Because they already have the term job, and because they are so fluent in English. In their repertoire, they already have this rich association, and job through two small steps is already associated with work. So with this, that works for me. So why not use job directly, since we have job already? So far it was only a noun. Now we can use it as a verb. And that's how it comes about. So when we have concepts where we have these resources very active, and they are being activated on a daily basis in a very, very salient, then we can use them in a much more systematic manner. Okay, concepts and language, let's have a closer look. I'm going to look at four domains that illustrate different aspects of linguistic diversity and fluidity, namely urban markets, the traditional locus of linguistic and social mixing, integration since ancient times, minority heritage language settings, where we face family multilingualism, but also ethnicity language ties, multi-ethnic adolescent peer groups, where we cross this ethnic identity for something in favor of something of multi or trans ethnic identities of locally born generations. And finally, digital social media, where I think we can write more outside codified norms, are not as restricted by codified norms. And this is what makes this interesting for me. These are all settings outside the confines of monolingual standard restrictions, ideologies of purism. So we have less policing, censoring of language along purist lines. So looking at such, I want to look at such language in such settings that are not dominated by a monolingual habitus, because these are the domains where these notions of perspectives of fluidity were first developed. I'm using, so what I hope to get, I want to show you are some insights from what I call free range language outside monolingual purist hegemonies. The metaphor of free range language, think of this just like free range eggs. It's actually not the eggs that are ranging about freely, it's the chickens. And it's not the language that's free range, it's the speakers. It's the ones who produce language, produce not in the sense of an object. So this is more understood as, say, open air sports, which is also not an object, but an activity. So free range language as an activity where speakers are not as restricted by outside norms. Let's have a look at the first example, an urban market. I brought you a transcript here from the Berlin-Maybach-Ufer market. That's close to where I live. Do some of my grocery shopping there. So I thought it might be nice to have a project there, and so I can go there professionally, and it counts like work. So what we found there were interactions like the one I'm showing you here, and I give you a second to just read it and read the transcriptions. So what I like here is this is truly open. People are allowed to use their resources. So you're not restricted to a specific socially constructed language, but you're getting in whatever it takes. You're using everything, and you're enlarging your repertoire. You're getting in new resources with every encounter, and then you use them. So in the next encounter, she might use Hebrew, the speaker C. That does not mean anything goes. Quite the opposite. In this context, you find a lot of standard German grammar, but you also find something specific to the market. And this is a recurring, or several patterns. This is one recurring grammatical pattern I observed there. So when you're a market crier, you might say something like broccoli 2 Stück 1,50, meaning broccoli 2 piece 150. So I'm offering 2 pieces of broccoli for 150, or 2 piece 150 broccoli, or mango box Kiste 3, or €3. So at first this sounds a bit like everything goes actually, but what this is you have in the middle, you're naming the quantity and the price, and they are always adjacent. And in the periphery, either in the left periphery or on the right periphery, you name the kind of product. And one grammatical thing I liked about this, one grammatical characteristic, you have to use singular forms, or I would rather call it transnumeral. So these are non-plural forms. So when I asked speakers in interviews later, when we did some focus group interviews, can you say 2 mangoes or 2 kisten, 2 boxes? And they said, not mangoes, mango. Nobody says mangoes here. Kiste, box, not boxes. That's how one talks on the market. No plural on the market. So there is grammar. People know about the grammatical structure. There is some structure. At the same time, total fluidity when it comes, or total openness when it comes to which language I use, what resources from what domain I want. How can we account for that? So we can account for the syntax. I suggest this as some kind of coordinated structure, which can capture also the adjacency, but also that the order is free. Semantics, I marked, color-coded the elements from syntax that go with which elements in the semantics, if you're interested. But for us today, important, the communicative situation is that of a market. And that means it's element of the informal situations, and crucially, it's agnostic with respect to language or languages. So there is no language marker. You can use just whatever you want. This is a truly multilingual construction, or rather a translingual construction. It has open slots. There are some default languages that are language indices that might be associated with it. We're still in the middle of Germany, which is a country with a very strong monolingual habitus. So German as the hegemonial language still exerts a lot of influence and is used often. Turkish is a very salient heritage language in my neighborhood, so this will occur. And English as the global language that you use, say, with tourists a lot. But in principle, any elements are possible, and you can, for instance, add elements from Hebrew as a new resource whenever you like. What we also find on the market is that people seem to repeat themselves in different languages. And first question, why do they do this? Why do they say Leckerbrot, Tazebrot, first in German, then in Turkish? You've already said delicious bread, why say it again in a different language? And this is something my 2 PhD students of mine investigated. You can see us here having a mocha break on the market. Serkan Yüksel and Irem Duman. And Serkan Yüksel found out that, captured this with a new concept, namely understanding this as some kind of commercial code switching. There is a conscious effort to switch the code in order to attract more customers, for instance. This has a commercial purpose. Irem Duman analyzed when do people use what? So there seem to be some strong ethnicity language ties. People are using specific resources from a specific socially constructed language because this is associated with a specific speech community, and they construct the customer walking by as belonging to this community. So here we have a higher order indexicality to speech communities. We have an index to the multilingual market. There is a lot of multilingual pride on this market. So this is a kind of belonging to the market setting itself. On the other hand, we have an index to specific ethnicities of passers-by. So there is some kind of belonging to different groups, Turkish versus Arabic, for instance. Let's have a look at the second kind of setting, minority heritage language settings. So if we look at heritage Turkish in Germany, we have two influences. In Germany, strong monolingual habitus, the default is that any composite is indexed with D. German is the default here. In Turkey, which was the sending country of the first generation, usually the parents or grandparents of the speakers, the default is every composite is indexed with Turkish, but also quite a lot of Kurdish. So what happens with heritage Turkish in Germany? In peer groups, you are part of informal composites indexed with German, Turkish, and maybe also some Kurdish. So you can use, and more, but you can use these indices, you can use resources from there. But if you speak to a teacher, say in German class at school or in maths class or indeed any old class at school, you're except for language classes, you're expected to speak German. So communication with the teacher is an element of these composites that are formal and indexed with German. But then something interesting comes in, something that Möller described for heritage Turkish in the Netherlands as well. When you meet your, say, in his case, it was your prospective in-laws, who are also from the heritage Turkish community, in his case in the Netherlands, let's say in Germany, then you might speak Turkish with them. So what you're using is, you're feeling yourself in a situation that is formal and indexed with Turkish, even though your in-laws do speak German and Turkish and are quite happy mixing Turkish and German all the time. But this is a formal situation and we're all watching out to speak properly. So suddenly we're speaking Turkish. So this socially constructed language can work as a formality marker. The separation of languages can work as a formality marker. What is it like in Namibia? In Namibia, we do not have this monolingual habitus. What does heritage German look like there? Can we always, or do they also use language separation then? So in Namibia, the sending country of the first generation was Germany. As I said many times, monolingual habitus, default is composite is indexed with D, German, always German. But in Namibia, the default is something I called NAM, and I don't mean Namibian as the language. With NAM, I mean any language that works in Namibia, any language that you can use. Namibia has 13 so-called national languages, but many more are spoken. There are you use them depending on different ethnicities, domains. There is most certainly no monolingual habitus and a lot of language mixing. So you don't have this specification so much. So heritage German then, in peer groups among heritage Germans in Namibia, they are part of element of the informal situations. You use mostly German, English, and Afrikaans. This is the typical situation. With a teacher at school, and there are German schools where a lot of, or most of the heritage German children go, you use, it's part of formal composites, and it's indexed for D with German. You use mostly German, but you will still use English and Afrikaans, even in a setting where you're totally expected to only use German in a classroom situation. And this is so strong that even happens for the teachers. So pupils from heritage German, pupils from Namibia taught me of a situation where they had this kind of, is it piggy bank in English? This kind of cashier where they had to put a Namibian dollar whenever they used an English or Afrikaans word. And actually their teacher had to contribute quite a lot to this piggy bank. So even though you're expected to use language separation as a formality marker, it might not be that strong, depending on the larger context your composite is in. Something I found interesting that Namibian Germans do as well is this, and in this case, it's not commercial code switching, but it's saying the same thing in different languages. In this case, in Afrikaans, English, and German, all the same word perhaps. This comes from communication on a website for German Namibians in Europe that was investigated by Henning Radke. And here, I think they use this again as an index to as a higher order indexicality, as an index to the speech community, namely similar as to this one aspect in the market to a multilingual community, some multilingual pride. We are Namibian Germans abroad, and we are multilingual. We know Afrikaans and English just as well, and we mix it. Let's have a look at the third example, multi-ethnic adolescent peer groups. What we find here is the emergence of urban contact dialects, which I defined as urban vernaculars, drawing on a term by Ben Renton, that emerged in context of migration-based linguistic diversity among locally born young people, marking their speakers as belonging to a multi-ethnic peer group. So what happens in these situations? Interestingly, these arise in local settings, in comsits that are always multilingual, but they can arise of a societal habitus that might be multilingual or monolingual. In the first case, this has an effect on the outcome, on the form of this urban contact dialect. In the first case, it can take the form of a multilingual mixed language. We have a multilingual societal habitus, then this multilingual comsit supports a multilingual mixed language, a lot going on. If we have a monolingual societal habitus, this is kind of keeping us back. And then the best we can hope for is a majority language dialect, a dialect of the hegemonial language via some contact-related changes. First is the dominant pattern in Africa, the second in Europe, but there are some counterexamples. It's not about geography, it's about societal habitus. So what happens? In this peer group, we have multilingual mixed language, for instance, like Camfranglais in Cameroon, where you have a French grammatical frame, English and Hausa lexical elements. If you have a monolingual habitus, like in Germany, you might get something like Kiezdeutsch, which is the German urban contact dialect. And there we might also have some resources from other languages in, but it's less frequent. It does happen, like the example of Walla. And sometimes we even get a transfer of syntactic patterns. This is the Teller-Meller, the M reduplication, and I'm going to come to this in a few slides, but it's very rare, it's exceedingly rare. We do have it, but it doesn't really happen as often. So the impact of the macro context, namely the strength of the monolingual hegemonies, is a gradual one. We do have integration, even under conditions of a monolingual habitus, like in Kiezdeutsch, but they're not a far cry from what we see in Cameroon. So we have gradual rather than categorical differences, which I think shows the power of comsits. The comsit, the multilingual comsit, the local setting exerts its power here and supports something at least a little bit multilingual. What is the comsit like? It's part of peer groups. MUY refers to multi-ethnic urban youth. This is the setting. The comsit is that of a peer group, and that is very much in the awareness of speakers. And here I have two strikingly, I think, similar quotes from Germany and Tanzania, where adolescents emphasize that you speak that with your friends, not with your parents. So in general, this MUY, this multi-ethnic urban youth, is a comsit is element of informal comsits because the peer group comsits are element of informal comsits. Now, under the conditions of a multilingual habitus, we don't get a strong language index, but rather defaults. And we can even have variation, variable indexing. For instance, South African Tsotsitaal can have two different grammatical bases, Zulu or Afrikaans. So you can even exchange the index, so to speak. Now, under conditions of a monolingual habitus, we get the majority language index as a default. For instance, Kiez, as for German Kiezdeutsch, the multi-ethnic urban setting in Germany, is element of informal settings and formal composites indexed with D. Hence, Keats as the setting for Keatsdeutsch gets indexed with D. But there will be an association with minority language settings because we have a lot of heritage speakers, a lot of minority language speakers in the community, which makes for a higher permeability. It's associated with a trans-ethnic identity because elements are used across ethnicities. And it can also index coolness through the association with a specific speech community. So what does coolness look like in the lexicon? Let's now look at the MRID application that I mentioned. This MRID application I exemplified with what was a teller mela. So plate made literally, with made not meaning anything. Mela isn't a word. So what you're doing is you're repeating the same word again, but this time the onset is M. This comes from Turkish MRID application or mümele. What is specific to German, I marked in green here. That's for one, that you're replacing the whole onset and not just the first consonant. This shows the grammatical integration into German again. Syntax, just two nouns. Semantics, the first refers to some kind of entity, the second to nothing. Now the pragmatics is that the speaker might be in a negative, have a negative attitude towards this. Teller, mela, yeah. Or it might be, and this is a semantic constant I introduced, the C stands for chilled. This is what the speakers told us it means. When you speak like that, you show you're chilled, you're cool. Yeah. So this comes from the composite. The composite is Keats, and this is something that is indexed with German, but associated with a certain speech community and can accordingly have some coolness with it. It will still be associated, in addition, with the heritage Turkish through the peer group where we have heritage Turkish as a very salient heritage languages. This does not mean that Keatsdeutsch is part of a heritage Turkish community, but that a lot of speakers know heritage Turkish as well. And this association will be even stronger here because it's associated with this Turkish mümele pattern. Okay, let's come to the last example, digital social media. So if you have just sent some text instead of listening closely to me, you might have used things like emoji or the 3 dot. Here's an example from a corpus where Annika Labens, a PhD student of mine at me, looked at exactly these things, namely emoji and 3 dot as graphic discourse markers. As you can see here, they are used as something to express some kind of discourse meaning. Interesting for me now is that these are kind of translinguistic elements with no fixed language affiliation. You would have understood the emoji on the left side and the 3 dots as well without knowing any German. In principle, you can have different usage patterns in different language contexts, in different composites, or indeed for different age groups. But this is only these might only be very specific patterns. In general, you have a lot of overlap. So in general, these are translinguistic elements. How can we account for these? So in the phonology, you would have some Unicode thing, for instance, and here we come to the age differences. So the one on the left is the smiley I would use. This is the variant for the boomers among us. The second is the cool one, as my daughters tell me. This is the real smiley. That's for the younger crowd. So the syntax tells us this can be after a CU, a communicative unit, or before it. This is an ordered set, meaning the one on the left is more common. Usually you put an emoji behind your message, not in front of your message. Pragmatics can be intersubjective, subjective, or textual discourse functions. And you have these general linear functional associations that we found that apply for discourse markers in general and also apply here. Namely that the left periphery further supports subjective meanings, the right periphery intersubjective ones. Now the composite is just digital social media, which is element of informal written, but not informal written of a specific with a specific language index. So here, this accounts for this being a translinguistic element. We have a certain concept, but this is not part of one specific language. It's just general. Okay, let's wrap up. How did we manage to reconcile fluid resources with grammatical systems? I think 3 points are important. The first is the primacy of communicative situations. Through the co-occurrence of resources in specific situations, we have the emergence of systems, not the other way around. Languages then work as social indices with, in principle, permeable boundaries. And from languages, we can, or building on language, we can also have higher order indexicalities to speech communities. And 4 kinds of free range language settings that I discussed point to language agnostic constructions, think of the market, translinguistic elements, emoji. They point to the use of language separation as a formal register marker, for instance, in heritage settings, and the power of composites over macro context purism ideologies, as we've seen for urban contact dialects. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a lovely presentation. Very, very clear, very interesting. And we're now open for questions from you, people watching, and answers or responses anyway from Heike. So can you put them into, if you put them in the chat, I can relay them to Heike. Heike can see them herself and pick them. Nothing there.
Never had that before. With from YouTube to Zoom.
Yeah, I know. Well,
to
things
audio.
get lost a little bit in the middle. You know, technological problem.
Fun.
Now, I'll start off with a question to you, Heike, and that is, I have difficulty with this notion of fluidity. I have difficulty with the notion of free range. You know, you talk about the market, but if people don't sell their goods, they can't feed their families at night. If you're an adolescent, you know, adolescents bite their fingernails through the stress and the anxiety of being a teenager. I'm not so sure that it's such a free range, freewheeling venue as you're suggesting on the basis of the linguistic patterns. I wonder if you'd like to respond to that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And as we all know from our youth or from our children now, being a teenager, I mean, you have to really be like everyone else, much stricter than later. With free range, I don't mean everything goes. And obviously not everything goes at the market, which is why what I found interesting. Yeah, you have a grammatical pattern and you're actually following it. No plural at the market, as one of the sellers put it. What I mean with free range is language outside the confines of specific hegemonies, namely that of purist attitudes, purist ideologies. The idea you must use one language in one situation, monolingualism, or this one language has to be standard, whatever, English, German, Russian, standard language ideologies. So, I mean, the metaphor even works there. If you think of free range chickens, they can't do just anything, but they can behave naturally. They are outside the confines of some strange cage. And that's how I would see these ideologies, like some strange cage. Yeah, no.
Then aren't you using some kind of external ideology that, you don't, you know, it's an empirical question, how far and when adolescents orient to the standard language and when they don't. And it seems to me that you know, if you're in a pond, if you are in the pond, you have to look at the things that are closest to people, and you have to look at, you know, how the currents, what the vegetation's doing, what the, I don't know, what else is going on. And I'm just a little bit concerned that you're anchoring your overall characterization to you know, to something that needs to be evidenced in the talk and in the encounters, the interactions you're drawing your data from, as being actually the most important point of orientation.
Yeah.
Rather than some marginal thing that people, they know about, but they only come to it occasionally.
What I mean with free range is really that this is what is natural. So if you take a really broad look at the history of our species, like most of the time we were hunter-gatherers in small groups, and nobody would come up with something like monolingual attitudes there, ideologies there, standard language ideologies. You would want to speak in a way that works with your community, but not necessarily in a monolingual standard idea. I think of what Thomas Bach, for instance, discussed is these exolinguistic marriages in hunter-gatherers communities, where you marry somebody who speaks a different language than you. That makes for more mixing. Or what Dalit Assoulineh investigates in Israel, where she looks at ultra-Orthodox communities who say, it doesn't matter how you speak, child. You just speak different than the outside world. You speak like we speak. You can use this gender or that gender for one and the same noun. It doesn't really matter, but just speak like your parents. So there are restrictions and there are patterns and there are rules, but they are not as unnatural as a monolingual habitus.
Yeah.
So, I like this metaphor of I forgot who used it, of sedimented use. Yeah, think of it like one of these paths that people make by, say, taking a shortcut through a patch of grass, what we call Trampelpfad in German. I think it's trail or something. So one starts it, then others, and soon people will let themselves be restricted by its shape.
Yeah.
And then comes the local government and put some asphalt there. Now everyone has to walk there, but it doesn't work because the bikes go here to the parents, and then people do another path. So standard language is kind of this this asphalt, I think.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's right. There's undoubtedly kind of local and national and supranational ideological pressures and so forth. But there's another factor that I was kind of wondering about in your analysis, and it makes me wonder whether the com-sit might be just a little bit of a black box, and that is you know, the interactional dynamics underpinning or running through the data that you're analyzing. Would you like to comment on because I haven't heard you know, particular genres being discussed. I haven't heard kind of turn sequences or particular you know, those pressing problems that people have at particular points in an encounter. I haven't had that figuring in your encounter, though it's something that I would want, you know, a lot of people would bring to bear in an analysis of a communicative situation.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, the most I have committed myself at all to is there is something more and less formal, or mode might also play a role. And the reason is that I think is a communicative situation is whatever people make of it. So the communicative situation might be the market, but it might also just be this specific stall, or just these three friends together. And this can change. And you can only answer this empirically. Is this a specific communicative situation that supports certain, for instance, grammatical patterns, certain lexical patterns? That's how you can see it, that this is a communicative situation that's a bit distinct from another one. And I mean, for instance, one observation been often made, a lot of parents of bilingual children have made this. My daughter, when growing up, my husband is British, I'm German, we live in Germany. One of our daughters, obviously, or for me, obviously, had interpreted English as daddy's language. It's this quirk that daddy has, some kind of weird thing with him. He speaks English with everyone, everyone speaks English with him. Apart from that, we all speak German. So this is daddy's strange thing. And then our in-laws visited from Britain, and she refused to speak English with them. She spoke fluently English with my husband, and she noticed very soon that the in-laws don't understand a word of German. But so for her, the concept was speaking with daddy. And it took her several days, which I found super embarrassing at that time, several days to adjust that, no, that was the wrong interpretation of this communicative situation. It must be something else. Daddy and daddy's mommy speak like that. So it's much more fluent than just saying, we check what mode, is it formal, informal, who's the, and then we have ComSit 1A.3.
Okay, so you're basically your definition of a com situation is tied very much to the anchor to the question of what type of lexis you're going to choose, whether you're going to choose a German or English.
Lexis or patterns, grammatical patterns.
Yeah, okay, but even so,
linguistic behavior.
Yeah, but that seems to me quite a limited account of what's of a communicative situation. I mean, it's a language up view. It's or a grammar up view. It's anchored in grammar as the principal focus of the analysis. I mean, I'm thinking of, I like a lot Silverstein's notion of the total linguistic fact, which sees communication, language as it's actually used, as an interaction of linguistic form, situated interaction, and ideology. Okay.
Yeah.
And in fact, the notion of the total linguistic fact kind of resolves that opposition you suggested at the beginning, suggesting that sociolinguists were doing fluidity or whatever, while grammarians were doing structure and systems. You need, if you're going to analyze the total linguistic fact, you need to recognize the importance of all those elements. And you also need to know that to understand linguistic form, you need linguistics, formal linguistics. If you want to understand interaction, you need conversation analysis and so forth. And that being the case, I wonder, whether how your data would look if, instead of saying, right, we're going to anchor this in linguistic, we're starting with languages, linguistic form as our point of departure. I wonder how things would look if you said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to start our analysis in an interactional, a conversation analysis, let's say, of the marketplace interaction.
Yeah.
And I think, if you did that, then the notion of what's free flowing and what isn't, and what's fluid and what might look a bit different. And indeed, you might see that there were quite serious interactional constraints on what things you select. I mean, I'd done a lot of work on kids using each other's languages when I did work on crossing.
Yeah.
And from one point of view, you might say people can use other people's languages, but it wasn't. It was extremely constrained interactionally. If you used the terms from somebody else's ethnic group at the wrong point, you could get into serious trouble. You know, it was not something you. So people were very careful in how they the moments when they thought that they could. Oh, I can use a little bit of Jamaican here because this is a kind of a situation where it won't be taken too seriously. So I wonder. You know, it seems to me that that's the total linguistic fact and the significance of the interaction of the linguistic, the interactional, and the ideological working together present something of a challenge to the notion of fluidity. That is, you know, your kind of
I think we know. With fluidity, I mean that that communicative situations are not categorically distinct, but that we have something that they are merging into each other. So is this still the market situation, or is this me talking to my friend when I'm walking across the market? It does not mean that everything goes. And in fact, I did this whole project of the research at the market because I expected to find grammatical patterns, which we did. And I don't think you necessarily have to start with grammatical patterns. It's just through grammar or different lexical patterns, through linguistic differences, you might see that speakers perceive this as a different communicative situation. So this is just your decision where to start with. You can start with interaction and see people perceive this as a different communicative situation. They're interacting quite differently. And if you think of the total linguistic fact that if we want to use this pond metaphor, of course, the macro setting has an effect. Yeah, that's like the weather. If you have the micro setting or the climate as the macro setting, of course, it has an effect whether, for instance, you have an urban contact dialect in a monolingual or multilingual setting. That has a strong effect and a structural effect even in this case. But just think of yourself as a child. You're coming into this world and you notice that some things are being used with daddy and other things are being used with everyone else. And only later do you learn, this is called English and this is called German. But you didn't need this in order to function in this society. You just go into this, you're doing what others do. That's what I mean with comsits. And you interpret, try to find out, is this a language to speak with daddy, or is this a language to speak within the family? Is this how you speak with shopkeepers? And the differences can be quite subtle, like small dialectal differences. And small children in kindergarten have already been observed to speak quite differently when they're playing with their friend in the sandpit than if they are pretending to be a shopkeeper. Mm-hmm. So they see this as a comsit shopkeeper in a shop where you speak differently than when you're just hanging out in the sandpit. It's more like this. It's not fixed. It's your decision with what to start.
Well, I think this is a conversation that we could run quite a bit. Look, the chat is starting to fill up. Now, we have a number of comments here, but I can't see a question right away. Should we take a little bit to look at the? Would you like to take a moment to look at the comments? And you know, there may be some that you like to respond to. They're observations rather than questions. But Eric, if you'd like to put
I see the last one. It seems to from Eric Gomez. I live in a small town in Mexico where Spanish, Nicaragua, and Nahuatl are spoken by different communities. However, I don't observe them speaking their native languages when in the market. However, you can notice some adaptation in their Spanish in order to sell their products to all speakers. And once they identify the same modifications in the customers, it just switches. They switch to their native. And once they identify the same modifications in the customers, they switch to their native language. I can say that I find this very interesting. So this is a communicative setting, this market that is perceived as something where you should usually speak Spanish, but once you get into a heritage interaction, you in a bilingual interaction where you share some language, you might use this as well. And This looks to me also a bit like this commercial code switching that Serkan Yüksel has identified. So you're trying to make it, or the ethnic linguistic ties that Iram Duman analyzed, you try to make it, you make your customer feel like you belong to the same group. This adaptation to customers at marketplaces, I think, is quite common.
You use a number of terms to talk about the kind of knowledge and capacity in the course of your paper, to talk about the knowledge and capacity that individuals have. You use the word multi-competence, mind, repertoire, habitus, feature pool, indeed. Would you like to comment on how these terms are related?
Yeah, what I like about multi-competence, which is, as everyone knows, not my term, it refers to speakers' competences rather than just separating languages. When I speak of multilingualism, that is like I have 2, 3, 4 languages in my mind, whereas multi-competence is just, it focuses on what speakers can do with the resources they have. And the repertoire would then be the totality of what speakers can do with these resources. Yeah, not just the linguistic resources themselves, but the way they can be applied in use, in interaction, interacting with different concepts. So when you think of a feature pool, that is the way these linguistic elements as part of these resources that you have there might interact with each other, form systems, form this kind of pond. And the habitus, I would say, is some kind of, it's the macro context. The habitus can have it's usually you have this kind of societal habitus that can filter down into the micro context. It can influence what part of resources you may or you're expected to use in different concepts.
So if you were going to do a kind of socio-cognitive model of people's linguistic knowledge, what would the ingredients be? Was there a slide that you showed us that was, in essence, your image of organization of language in the mind?
I think it would basically be the one where you're coming from this all is connected to some connections are strengthened, so that you have these different resources that I just did as little bubbles being marked 1 to 5 or something, and how they are forming systems. This is what fascinates me in language always, like the way patterns emerge, where you form systems, and these systems then might be distinct, and they might take on what I used as a different coloring, different association, but in your mind they are still just different resources that you can bring to bear on the situation, on the communication you want to achieve.
Okay. So you had that picture of the feature pond. Feature pond, which then became varieties. Is that right? Or
can become? Yeah, doesn't necessarily have to.
And then beneath the feature pond was the feature pool. Now, I didn't quite understand where the feature pool comes from, because actually people are born into ponds. They're born into ponds. Your house is a pond. Your daughter was learning about the frogs come or whatever. And so I wonder how the pool at the bottom comes out. And I wonder whether actually your notion of the feature pool needs to be placed up above the feature pond as some kind of rather secondary set of abstractions produced by linguists and other language ideologists. Okay.
Well, I'd say children come into a certain society and they learn different elements.
Right.
words first, but then they might interpret different elements. And they just use them across board. So they don't connect them with particular communicative situations yet. That comes later. They slowly learn, this always co-occurs here, this always co-occurs here. So when we lived in the States for a year, my daughter suddenly would always say, Oze in front of every noun, in German and in English alike. I found out that in their childcare, the teachers would always say, oh, it's a doggy. Oh, it's a cat. Oh, it's when reading these picture books. So she thought Oze is some kind of noun marker or whatever marker. And she used this in German and English alike. She said, Oze Ameis, Oze this, Oze Wauwau. And only later do you then differentiate more. Yeah, because for this, you need to learn more about social situations, what is important, what counts. Why do I have to speak this, in this case, this weird language with mommy? I was the weirdo there. And everyone else does something different.
But in which case, what you're saying is that the feature pool is part of the pond. It lives in the pond. Because I mean, I would doubt that any child learns any words without they're having some kind of pragmatic associations. I mean, they're learnt in action. Or are you making some kind of Chomskyan claim about pre-social, pre-experiential?
No, but I think it's always about the social. So you're learning words with the social situation, but you don't know what counts as important in this social situation. No. So you're learning it, you're trying out, and then you find out what fits where.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I suppose there I would question a bit your emphasis on you and the choosing individual, because it seems to me that actually even little kids are pretty much the production, the co-production, the co-construction of their parents. You know, it's a relationship rather than, so they're pretty much steered.
In order to find out what's important and what counts as the important features of this situation that restrict what I should say there and what I shouldn't, that comes gradually. And I think this kind of having everything connected first, then losing some connections, strengthening others, that is the learning process per se. That's what our neurons do, or if we're lucky and are still learning, they still do this. Some of us are fossilized, but you know, that is just what happens when you're picking out, this wasn't really important. This is the important bit.
Interesting. I mean, I would be very interested to hear how other people respond to this, because I mean, I think we're talking at I think we're coming from slightly different. We're focusing on, we focus on fairly similar empirical material, but I think, coming to this as a linguist, you've got a different frame of mind, a set of references, a different set of references. So I mean, hunter-gatherers, you talked about neurons, which are kind of another universe for my
you said my home is a pond, Ben.
Well, I can live with that, but anyway, but so I mean, I may be pushing on a different kind of I'm bringing a slightly different subdisciplinary perspectives, and so maybe kind of missing a lot of what you're saying, or kind of setting up irrelevant,
or vice versa.
Well, whatever. Let's questions from in the chat. Now, I can't believe we're based in Brazil, so I can't believe that everybody's clocking off early to go and watch England play Denmark.
When do they start, by the way? When do they start, or have they started already?
They've got lots of time to. They've got lots of time.
Where's your flag?
That's my flag. Yeah, it is. So would you like? I mean, if we're not getting things coming through on the chat, so maybe you'd like to round up and kind of summarize your view, and where next in this analysis?
So I really like bringing things together. So I want to continue working on this and kind of applying it to more and harder cases. And I'm glad this gets recorded. I have to say, I will watch this discussion period again, because I want you're asking really hard questions, and that's exactly what I like. Okay, so what does it really look like? What is the index? Why do you need this? Does communicative situation help you for this particular behavior in a multilingual encounter, or on a market, or in a very very narrow standard language monolingual habitus situation even?
So looking for new situations, you're saying?
That's right. Oh, I mean, I showed you the projects where I'm coming from. So just looking at the data again with fresh eyes and trying out. Right now we're preparing some experiments, asking people about their emoji use, or how does this get interpreted. I think it can give you a new view to think of. This is not about language, it's about the communicative situation. Language might secondarily come in, but doesn't really have to.
Yes. Yes. And would you like to just comment? I mean, I was very, as I said at the beginning, I was really impressed by that, wir alle sind die mehrsprachige Stadt. We are all the multilingual linguistically diverse city. We're all the multilingual linguistically diverse city. Your description of your center in Berlin, that's a strong statement. Do you want to just elaborate on it as your kind of?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's said is that, like it's said for everyone, is the pandemic kind of closes us in a lot at the moment. But we are planning on doing more activities once we're all hopefully soon open again. We want to empower people. We want to bring more linguistic results into the society, and vice versa, work together with people to understand themselves as well. I really like this term, multi-competent, rather than being reduced to these ethnicity language ties that you have so much. So to go into schools and tell people, if somebody is multilingual, that's actually a good thing. Doesn't mean you should construct him or her as Turkish, for instance, just because she knows Turkish as well in addition to German. You should not have these pictures of Berlin. Here it's Turkish, here it's Arabic, here it's Vietnamese, and then little flags of different countries. And so we're working very much against these language, ethnicity, country ties that I think prevalent in our society, to try out, to empower pupils, to even to talk with them about pragmatics versus grammar, and make German classes more interesting at school. So the whole range of linguistic diversity and Buntheit, how multicolored things are, to bring this into society more.
And that's a very fascinating context in which to bring the very rigorous traditions of grammatical description to bear. It's an absolutely fascinating project. Yeah. I think we might wind up. Do you think?
Yes.
So it's for me to say thank you very much indeed, Heike. I hope to see you soon. In
person, if possible. Thank you very much, Ben. I'm so grateful you did this today. And
and we were just saying what a wonderful thing Ibralin ao vivo is. Extraordinary. It's known of all over. Everybody I know knows of it. Watches. It really is not everything that's happened in the last 18 months. Something like this is.
Some good came out of it, and Abralin ao vivo is certainly one of this.
Thank you very much indeed, Heike. Thank you, Abraline, and thank you for all the people who've been, watching, and thank you to the people who later on watch us on YouTube.
That's right, until eternity.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
Thanks a lot, Ben.
Thanks a lot, Heike. Thank you.
And good luck to England, huh?
Yeah.